That's kind of a showstopper statement, right? You cannot serve God and wealth. And we're going to focus on that. This is another one of those sermons when preaching on the Gospel of Luke, where Luke, more than any other gospel writer, actually deals with human lives, human experience. What our human experience is, including our social fabrics, our economic life, and so on. So this is another one of those, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just unpacking what Jesus says, and we can talk about it over coffee. So, the parable from Luke 16 that we read today has often been called the parable of the dishonest manager. But I think that's really a misnomer. The issue isn't that he's dishonest. The issue is what? Why is he fired? He's not fired for being dishonest. He's being fired for something else. Why is he fired?
Dishonesty.
Say it again?
Dishonesty.
No, it's not dishonest. That's an interesting thing. What is he? Squandering. He is fired for squandering. That's his charge. And then the other little manipulations of the bills he does that is labeled dishonest, that happens later. But he is fired for squandering. This squandering plot line, right? Squandering the gifts that God has provided him, that the rich man has provided him. This squandering plot line in the parable reminds me of a New Yorker cartoon that I really like. Anybody here ever read the New Yorker cartoons or look up New Yorker cartoons? I grew up on them. And so the one that that was reminded of with this squandering plot line is the one that I've actually printed in the bulletin. So I'm going to invite you to turn and open your bulletin, and you should find, if you're in the sanctuary, you should find a picture of this particular cartoon. And those of you who are watching online, you're going to have to content yourselves with the description. In the cartoon, we see God and an angel standing on a cloud in heaven. You with me so far? You find the cartoon? Is it there in the bulletin? Okay, it is. All right. So God's up in heaven, standing on a cloud, and with him is an angel. And so God is talking with the angel, and God's kind of looking over his shoulder back on earth. Right? And then comes the punchline that's underneath the cartoon, and it is this. This human experiment has gone on long enough. Give the hippos control. I think that's a funny joke. You may not, but I think it's funny. At the center of the joke is the long-standing butt, and B-U-T-T, of creation jokes, right? The mighty hippo. As it says in the Christian children's song about creation, in the middle of creation, God had some fun. He made a hippo that weighs a ton. And if you would like to learn that song, I'm happy to teach it to you. Come to preschool Sunday school. We'll let that go by. What's the point of this cartoon? It is that humans have failed so miserably at the task assigned to them. Better to replace them with someone else, anyone else, even the lowly hippo would do a better job of managing God's affairs on earth. And that is the same plot line that we have in this particular parable, right? The rich landowner says, oh, nope, you have squandered your chance, you've squandered my gifts. I'm going to bring in the hippos, or I'm going to bring in another manager. Put the earth under new management. Of course, the cartoon is not the first example of this kind of plot line of God running out of patience with humanity and wanting to place the earth under new management. We have lots of stories in the Bible that have that theme. What's the big one from the Old Testament? God wanting to put the earth under new management. Flood story, right? God comes and he floods the earth and gets rid of all creation except of Noah. Right? That's the big squander your opportunity, new management biblical story. Then there's a story we read last week, right, with the Israelites and the golden calf. Moses is able to intervene so that God doesn't, in fact, get rid of the Israelites and get new management, but it comes close. And then there are many, many parables of Jesus, like today's, where Jesus talks about landowners owners or rich persons changing the management. It's an allusion in part to God revoking the authority of the religious leaders in Jerusalem and placing salvation in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's look more closely at today's parable. What's the critique of humanity? Why is the rich man representing God so angry that he fires his squandering manager? The problem is the inadequate human capacity for stewardship, for taking care of the blessings that God has provided and entrusted us with. To understand the importance and the obligation of stewardship, we have to recognize that God's role in creation didn't just stop on the seventh day after God created the earth and the sky and the birds and the hippos and the human beings in one blast of creative spirit. We have to recognize that God's creation continues across all time by continuing to provide for us, right? Like those pictures I showed the kids, right? From the earth to the water, to love, to music and art, family and friends, bread, whatever we need, what knowledge and what riches we possess. And it's always that last picture, right? It's always when we get to money where we suddenly say, ooh, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. I'm not sure how to steward that. What does that mean? According to our Christian lens, the wealth we possess is not simply the product of our own private hard work and risk-taking, although that clearly is part of the equation. The wealth we possess through talents and opportunities is provided to us as part of God's creative act. By the way, if you want to really learn about this idea of God's continued creation, just go back to Luther's Catechism. The way he unpacks the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments is very much this, right? God is always providing all across time. So, because God's creation is ongoing, our human responsibility for stewardship is ongoing. In the contemporary age, we have distinctive challenges regarding stewardship. It's a really big question for our age today. How do we rightly steward the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of science and technology and natural resources and financial resources God puts at our disposal? How do we responsibly steward the massive amounts of wealth present in the world? How do we responsibly steward scientific innovations? That's a particularly important question, right? Ever since the 1940s and the development of the atomic bomb, for example. The development of the atomic bomb required profound ethical reflection and constraints placed on how we use it. Similarly, the science of genetics, human genetics, right? It's another development where we really ponder how do we steward that capability. And now we have the development of artificial intelligence that similarly requires of us, according to biblical mandates, to consider the right and the best ways to steward this new technology. How do we employ these gifts of wealth and knowledge and science in ways that are neither squandered nor cruel? It's a big ethical question. We have a sober obligation as Christians to steward well all of God's blessings, beginning with the first day of creation across all time in history. But based on our readings today, God is especially concerned and gets especially annoyed with how human beings steward wealth. Our parable closes with those harsh words for us: you cannot serve both God and wealth. Now, I don't know that that's true. I think you can steward wealth in alignment with your faith in God, and that's what we're going to look at today. God, through the prophets and through the parables of Jesus, demands that we consider how we treat people who are poor and how we understand and use wealth. That is just central. It's a central theme in our Christian texts. God gets angry. God gets very angry in the Bible when humans mistreat people who are poor. And we see it especially in the prophet Amos, whom we read today. We see it in Amos many times, how God uses Amos to expose corruption and how merchants cheat the poor for extra profit. and God condemns it. God exposes likewise the corruption of judges and witnesses who are bought off by the rich so that the poor who are trying to defend themselves against financial abuse in court lose in court. How the poor are treated is also an issue in our gospel reading today, although in a slightly less obvious way. We see it in how the manager behaves after he has been threatened with firing. While he was squandering the rich man's money, the manager ignored the needs of the indebted people. Right? He doesn't ask them, hey, how can I help you work out your debt? Right? There's no debt relief early on. He doesn't care about the needs of the indebted. He doesn't use the monies that are entrusted to him by the rich person to help the people who are burdened with debt and poverty. Only after he's about to get fired does the manager do what God calls humanity to do for those overwhelmed by poverty and debt. The manager finally treats the poor with compassion by slashing the debts of the poor people who owe the rich man massive amounts of money. Those are huge amounts, right? He does it not because mercy and debt relief express the will of God or would engender loyalty to the rich man. No, why does he slash the debts then? He does it because he wants them to be loyal to him, right? He wants to benefit. The manager wants to benefit from the fruits of mercy himself. By reducing the poor people's debts, he inclines them to be loyal to him. He also, in the process, restores them to the landlord, but that's not his motivation. He's looking for a place to lay his head. At the heart of almost every religious tradition is some set of ethics governing how we should treat the poor, understand poverty, and how we should use wealth. At the heart of Christianity is the biblical record, and according to the biblical mandate, society should provide basic support for the poor and the needy, and some mechanism for debt relief, as well as mechanisms to protect the poor from thievery and corruption. I'm not making that up. It's in many, many of the prophets. That's the biblical mandate. And the New Testament, the book of Acts and the letters of Paul especially, give us, the church, a special mandate to care for and include people of all economic statuses, building one community across all difference. Christian ethics also requires us to evaluate our understanding of economics, not just our own pocketbook, but economics as a whole. And we're required by Christian ethics to also look at our attitudes towards wealth as a whole. Wealth is a good thing. I want to just be very clear. Wealth is a great thing. It is a good thing. But the question is, what do we do with it? How do we employ it? One of the greatest Lutheran ethicists alive today is alive here in America. She's a phenomenal female American scholar, Cynthia Molibita, and she recently wrote a book called Building a Moral Economy. And in that book, she stresses that economic life, how we as individuals and how we as a society practice economic life, is not a secular practice. It is a sacred, spiritual practice. Christian economics is rooted in the command to love our neighbor. And I want you to think back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember the parable of the Good Samaritan? Right? It's supposed to be illustrating mercy, love of our neighbor. So what are the two features of that Good Samaritan? The Good Samaritan pays attention to the man in the ditch, right? He goes towards him and he heals his wounds. But what else does he do? He picks him up, he carries him to an inn, and does he say, innkeeper, just take him? No. He opens his wallet and he gives the innkeeper the money to care for the man he found in the ditch. He shares his resources. Cindy Molibita advises this, that we see economic life as a spiritual practice, a way of either enacting a spirituality of neighbor love or betraying it. Our economic practices, through the systems of which we are a part, she goes on to say, may damage or destroy neighbors, or they may serve neighbors. I'm just going to read that quote one more time. Molabita advises that we see economic life as a spiritual practice, a way of either enacting a spirituality of neighbor love or betraying it. Our economic practices, through the systems of which we are a part, may damage or destroy neighbors, or they may serve neighbors' well-being. That's really hard to do. Just want to name that. That is so hard to do, because we have our own needs that we seek to meet. I wonder what God, standing on a cloud in heaven, looking back at earth and some of our current economic practices, might be thinking. What does God think up there on the cloud about the concentration of extreme wealth in the hands of just a few technology company owners and leaders? What does God think about reports of corruption in awarding contracts? What does God think about investment vehicles that drive up the cost of rents for the less wealthy? Not just in our largest cities, and we see it in New York, we talk about New York, but we have investment vehicles that lots of people are investing in that also happen in smaller communities. Pensacola, Florida has a massive poverty and homelessness problem now because investors have invested in housing and driven up the rental rates. Why do they do it in small towns? Because the margin of return is much higher than in the cities today. What does God think about making the acquisition of wealth the highest human goal over all other, even over love of neighbor and love of God? I'm not sure that sending in the hippos would help this time. It may take the second coming of Jesus. In the meantime, though, we can take responsibility for ourselves and our own discernments. We can discern how are we living out God's vision, economic vision. And we can help other people to ponder and consider the biblical mandate for creating a moral economy based on neighbor love. Amen.